My gosh, the last time we were together was in person in Boston, Massachusetts, just before the world changed in February of 2020. How are you?
Things are good. Things have certainly changed a lot, some for the better, and some are a little tougher these days, but I'm glad we have a chance to talk.
Me too. So, Erik, one of the changes that have gone on, maybe not receiving the same global attention as the pandemic, has been your move from MIT to Stanford. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your new job there.
Well, I'm loving it here at Stanford. I'm sitting here in my office right on the Stanford campus, and the people here are terrific. I get closer to Silicon Valley, a lot of people I interact with here. MIT was very good to me as well. And just yesterday I had spent all day talking to my old colleagues at MIT. In this virtual world, I guess distance doesn't matter as much, but it's been a chance for me to start a new research center called the Digital Economy Lab. And so we're diving into a lot of new issues around digital transformation and some of the other topics I'm sure we'll talk about.
Well, that's great. I hope and expect we will. So, of course, Erik, COVID has changed so many lives and so much change in business. I wonder if we could focus on the business for a moment, and if you could describe from your unique perspective some of the macroeconomic changes that you have observed during and as a consequence of the pandemic.
Well, the pandemic has been devastating for a lot of people, but it's also accelerated a lot of much needed changes in digital transformation. For instance, we were looking at work from home changes. At the beginning of 2020, about 1 in 6 Americans worked from home. By the middle, 20 weeks later, it was over half. So a huge transformation, really, I'd say 20 or more years of change compressed into 20 weeks. So that's something that I think parts of it are going to stay. Now that the pandemic is subsiding and people are getting vaccinated, I think a lot of people are going back to working in the office, but I don't think we're ever going to go quite back to the way we were before. People like me have learned the power of Zoom. We were talking earlier about my new setup here with my new microphone and everything. I've been teaching. We do our seminars now we have hundreds of people from all over the world participating. And so those changes, I think many of them are going to stick. And business is the same thing. I'm hearing CEOs saying that they want to keep an element of remote work in most of their workforce.
And many people in the legal industry particularly, but I think it's fair to say, and of course you would know far better, the world in general hear a lot about digital transformation, but they have a very fuzzy notion. And a lot of them would say, oh, well, that just applies to something like AI or some other tech. But tell us, it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. Digital transformation is a management change. It's a cultural change. It's a business process change. Technology is just the tip of the iceberg. And I mean that almost literally. We've measured the costs of digital transformation and the benefits of digital transformation. And the direct technology costs, hardware and software, is only about 10%, same as the share of the iceberg that's above the water. The other 90% is investment in new business processes, new skills, and really a broader cultural change. The thing is that those changes can take years, even decades at times. So we're in the early stages of a transformation of the economy. The legal profession is certainly in the bullseye of that. Lawyers are knowledge workers. They work with information. So these technologies affect them as much or more than they do any other industry.
Yeah, and I want to focus a little bit more about that because, as you know, serving as a faculty advisor to the Digital Legal Exchange, there is, particularly in the legal industry, a divide between the way lawyers are trained to think and the way people in the C-suite certainly are thinking. The pace is different. The tools that are routinely used are different. I'm wondering, as that is a predicate, what would you say, Erik, to a general counsel not like our friend Bill Deckelman, who's very, very bleeding edge, but what would you say to sort of much more of a digital skeptic kind of a general counsel as to why she or he should even consider embarking on the digital journey vis-a-vis the legal function?
Well, I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of lawyers I've run into, they're trained to find the risks and be conservative and be wary of changes that may put the organization in jeopardy. And I think it's important to keep that perspective, but you also have to remember that you also put the organization at risk by not changing, by not embracing some of these opportunities. And I think that right now we're one of those periods where a lot of companies, even whole societies, are being left behind because they're not embracing the need for change fast enough. Digital technologies are really affecting every industry, every business process. And we don't always know exactly how they're going to work out, but you have to embark on experimenting and trying some of these technologies and being ready to transform your organization. Ultimately, the companies that are going to be most successful are those that understand and embrace these changes. And the ones that are most at risk are the ones that hold back too far.
And is it fair to say, Erik, in your certainly very, very expert opinion, that digital transformation to be successful has to be a team sport, and the team has to redound throughout the entire enterprise and not just certain portions of it?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest mistakes companies make is they try to delegate business digital transformation to the chief information officer or some technologists. To really do it right, you need to change the entire organization. Let me give you a little story. On the way we have some perspective. When you look at the transformation that electricity led to in American companies over 100 years ago, initially the changes were very meager. In fact, companies that adopted electricity in their factories had little or no productivity gain. It took about 20 to 30 years before you saw a big boost in productivity, according to researchers like Paul David, who studied this issue carefully. Why did it take so long? Well, it's not because technology was a fad. It's not because electricity was a fad and unimportant. It's because people were not doing that holistic organizational wide change. At first, they simply tore out the old steam engines, put in a big electric motor, and changed little else. They delegated it to the technologists. That didn't really change productivity or performance. Only after 20 to 30 years, after the rest of the organization understood that they also had to embrace this change, did you see big productivity gains. We started seeing a reorganization of the factory floor with small electric motors at each station instead of one big steam engine. And the flow of materials and work process went naturally based on the order of operations and what needed to be done next, instead of based on what needed to be closer to the power source. When they made those kind of enterprise-wide changes, you saw a 100, 200% increase in productivity, just staggering. We're in a similar stage right now with digital technologies. Simply tearing out some processes and replacing them with digital processes isn't enough. We need to rethink how we organize production, how we connect to customers, how we connect to suppliers, and how work gets done.
Now, you have written famously about something called the productivity paradox. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that is essentially, in headline fashion, what you've just described. Is that right? And I wonder if you could expound upon it a little more in terms of specifically, let's take the legal function. Lawyers, of course, hear a lot about AI. Some of them say that it's going to drive us out of business. Others say it's much ado about nothing. I'm wondering how, the paradox, the productivity paradox might be manifest in the legal industry, and what steps might be taken to sort of accelerate law's learning curve.
Sure. Well, the paradox is really interesting. I've been looking at these technologies, and I think they're just awe-inspiring. The ability for machines to be able to read text and understand it, to generate text, to recognize images, sift through all sorts of legal documents and make sense of them to some extent. So there's lots of opportunities in the technology, but the paradox is when you measure productivity in the US economy, instead of accelerating, it's actually grown more slowly. Between the 90s and early 2000s, it grew at about 2.8% per year of steady growth. Since 2005, up until this last year, it only grew at about 1.3%, less than half as fast. And it's not just the US, similar data from basically all the OECD countries. So there's a worldwide slowdown in productivity growth. That to me was a big puzzle because I don't think the technology is a dud. So there's something else going on. And it comes back to what we were just talking about, this need for digital transformation. Simply buying technology doesn't generate benefits. You have to transform the enterprise. And that's a much harder job. It requires investment in digital capital, new business processes, organizational change. And companies take time to do that. And this generates what we call the productivity J curve, which is that at first, as you're making that transformation, it takes time and effort to reskill your workforce and reinvent your organization. All that churn and investment doesn't directly lead to output. But once you put that in place, you can harvest the digital capital and get better returns. So personally, I'm actually quite optimistic that the next few years, we're going to see the second part of the J curve, the upward part, and see much higher productivity growth. I think it's already beginning this year.
So is human behavior and resistance to change, which is such a part of the human condition for most people, are those the things that are really causing this lag between the latent potential of the technology and the realization of its true benefits?
It's part of it. I really say it's three things. Part of it is honestly just ignorance. People don't even realize that you need to make these changes. That's why I'm an evangelical about this and trying to get the message out that you have to make these organizational changes. A second part of it is that even knowing that you need to make the changes, it's hard to know exactly what to do. And so there's just a lot of creativity and invention and frankly, false starts. Some businesses have been very successful in reinventing their organizations and have gotten huge returns. Others have gone down the wrong path. And I have to say, if there's a cookbook that said you could just do X, Y, and Z and automatically succeed, it would be a lot faster. But the essence is that just as technologists have to invent new technologies, managers, lawyers, executives have to invent new business processes. And that takes time and effort, but we're doing it. And then thirdly, is what you just said, that even when you know what needs to be done, there end up being winners and losers, and there's some resistance, and people are naturally afraid of the unknown. And so there's a resistance to making the changes that need to be made. You put those three things together and you get a lot of inertia that slows us down from making the kinds of digital transformation that ultimately will unleash a lot of productivity.
To what extent do you think it would be fair to say, Erik, that from your perspective, digital transformation is really a corporate imperative as opposed a nice to have?
Well, it's certainly an imperative, and it's becoming more and more of an imperative each year. The companies that aren't making the changes are beginning to fall behind. We're seeing a growing gap between leaders and laggards. It was a little striking when we looked at digital capital investments, how it was extremely uneven. There are a few firms that are pulling away from the rest, and the ones that are being left behind won't just have lower performance. Eventually, they're going to go out of business.
Yeah, and that brings to mind another thing. You'd written, I know, in a recent article that during the pandemic, the companies that really made the most profound strides economically were the Amazons, the Googles, the Apples, who I think it's fair to say are digitally advanced or mature companies. What is it about them? Going back to the components of digital transformation, that they're doing so right? And why are they separating themselves from the pack?
Well, those companies certainly have leadership, and they have a culture, and they have competence in executing on digital transformation. And that's why they're multi-trillion-dollar companies now, and first time in the history of the planet we've had companies that are so successful. But more interestingly, if you take them out of the sample and you just look within every industry, you see the same kind of fractal pattern. there are about 10% of the companies in each industry that get the lion's share of the benefit. In fact, the top 20% have more than half of all of the gains, and the remaining 80% are almost stagnant in terms of their digital transformation. So it's not just those headline companies that we're familiar with. It's within every industry. There are a few leaders that are pulling away. And if you look, we have data going back about 25 years, you see the gap growing more and more over time. And tying it to your comment about the pandemic, we also just finished a paper about what we call digital resilience. The firms that had a stronger digital infrastructure already in place did substantially better in 2020 in terms of surviving the unexpected shock of the pandemic. They had higher sales, higher profitability, higher productivity, and higher market value. And the firms that didn't have as much digital infrastructure in place, according to our metrics, perform more poorly. Although by the end of the sample, we saw them investing more aggressively in some of these technologies. So they do seem to be trying to catch up.
And do you think part of the reason why the strong were getting stronger during the pandemic and the divide between the strong and the not so strong was growing is because the strong were also agile? And that really begs the question of, how does agility fit into this bigger puzzle, and how important is it for an individual as well as a business unit and an enterprise to be agile?
Well, these digital technologies are designed to increase the information metabolism of a company. They make it easier to sense and respond to changes in the environment. And so when you do see a shock like this, those companies naturally end up coming out ahead. So it's an investment not just in the present, it also creates options and opportunities to respond to shocks in either direction. They could be negative shocks, they could also be positive shocks. And as the world changes more rapidly, that agility becomes ever more valuable. And it's a bit of a Red Queen phenomenon. If you're not keeping up with everybody else, then you're falling behind. And you have to run faster and faster just to keep even with the competition.
Yeah, well, you probably more than anyone I can think of spend a tremendous amount of your time when you're not teaching and writing books. You spend a lot of time with the C-suite and boards of directors, I would imagine, as well. Mm-hmm. Why is it that they seem to be so focused on customers? And how do customers fit into the whole digital transformation narrative?
Well, one of the big differences I see between the more successful companies, the less successful companies, is how customer focused they are. And I know that's a mantra that you hear over and over, but it's really true. When I go to, I won't say the names of the companies, some of these top companies, they're constantly asking, how can we create more customer value, not just this quarter, but in the long run? And when I go to the less successful companies, I hear them saying, how can we match Wall Street's earnings for next quarter? They're predicting, 37 cents and we're coming in at 35 cents. What can we do about that? That second attitude is ultimately destructive. It misses the forest for the trees. So being customer focused is a way of organizing your thinking. How can you use this technology to create more value? And if you do create more value, ultimately that's going to come down to the bottom line. It's going to show up in the stock prices. But in the end of the day, it all starts with creating value for customers.
And on that, I think the studies show that law is really notorious for having pretty poor net promoter scores. We don't fare terribly well with our customers, even though if you ask a lawyer, how are you doing? They'll inevitably tell you, oh, we're doing a fabulous job with our customers. And in fact, as you know, at the Digital Legal Exchange, we've actually compiled data that shows the delta between how the business function thinks the legal function is doing and how the legal function thinks it's doing. I'm wondering what comes to mind in terms of how the legal function might begin to bridge that delta and be really, truly more customer centric, because as you know, just saying it doesn't make it so.
Well, it's a mindset. I think that there's different ways of thinking about your job. And if you think of it very narrowly, How do we prevent them from making a legal mistake? That leads to one kind of an outcome. And I can understand that mentality. But I think the most successful lawyers, as the most successful executives in any part of the business, think more broadly about how they can create broader value and consider the benefits as well as the costs of different types of actions. I'm a fan of the Net Promoter Score as one metric for that. You shouldn't, rely overly on any one single metric, but it does help remind people that there's a customer out there who should be considered. And when you see a flaw with a particular legal option, you might also want to think about, okay, what are some other ways we can achieve the end goals and create overall value rather than just be the adversarial person that only looks at one side of it.
We were talking a few minutes ago about your productivity paradox. That is, the delay between the initial investment in the technology and the realization or capitalization of that investment. That's attributable to, I guess, a slow uptake in change on the human side. I'd like to switch over for a minute and talk and ask your advice about what I would call the law's economic paradox. And by that, I mean that last year, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of law firms actually had banner years. And yet they are not certainly investing tremendously more in terms of technologies or other more holistic investment. And I'm wondering, what do you tell a partner at a law firm, a managing partner, and how do you convince them that you really should start thinking in terms of digital technology? And she, her, or he turns around and says to you, Erik, very smugly, I just had a record year, and that's not even on my radar screen. What do you tell them to, kind of get them to start thinking that sooner or later, digital transformation is going to affect them very directly?
Sure. Well, in sports and in business, you need to skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it is right now. And there's a real risk in being seduced by how do we harvest short-term gains as opposed to how do we invest in long-term success. And I think that that's true in 2020. It's true in every year. So let's take a look at Amazon. We were just talking about their success. For decades, they were not super profitable because they were making those investments, and it put them in a position to harvest a lot of gains in the long run. Bezos and company, they knew that at any point they could turn the dial and start, extracting more value back in year 2000 or 2005. But they decided that what they wanted to do was build a long-term sustainable business. I don't think anybody would question that turned out to be the right decision. And for a lot of executives today, they're faced with a similar trade-off. Do you make that investment in digital capital, both the technology and the business process change, to build a successful, viable, profitable business for the long run? Or do you try to extract as much benefit as you can right now?
And herein, I think, lies something I won't say unique to the legal industry, but in the legal industry, you've got, for example, lawyers who work in-house for a company. Those lawyers, of course, are going to be much more sensitive to things like share price. They're going to be more sensitive to the company's customers. And so they may bill for the long term. But you've got law firms who have a very different economic model. Theirs, as you well know, the traditional partnership structure is one that is built really on, not a long-term philosophy. It worked long-term when, when change was not as rapid as it is today. But today you have someone who's within 3 years of retirement. They tend to be, the people with the largest stake in the short-term economic impact of the firm. And they turn around and say, why should I invest for the long term if I'm not going to reap the gains? I mean, it's not publicly traded. I'm wondering, and I realize, Erik, that this is a question that maybe is a little unfair to pose, but with that apology, I'm wondering what kind of argument might you say to them that, hey, we realize that in the short term, you may be leaving some money on the table, but in the longer term, this is really, critical to the viability and continued success of the firm and its good name.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's a false choice. We've all dealt with lawyers of both type, the ones that seem to be just maximizing short-term returns and in for a quick buck, and the ones that are genuinely thinking of this as a partnership, that are looking for the long-term interest, whether they're working in-house or externally. And I think all of us enjoy working with the guys who you feel like are real partners and who are looking for the long-term interest. They're the ones that I think in the long run, and even in the short run, end up being more profitable and more successful. It comes down to trust and partnership. And that's a mindset that I see a lot of very successful lawyers building right from the start. I'm not sure all of it directly translates into the dollar this quarter, but I think that you end up building a reputation that accumulates over time. And you may be right. I don't know if there's a little bit of a principal agent problem, as economists call it, where the lawyer who's making those kinds of investments doesn't get all the benefit directly, but I nonetheless think that it's the right thing to do, and it's probably more satisfying as well on non-monetary dimensions.
Yeah, and before passing on, I completely agree with you, Erik, and I'm not in any way seeking to indict big law partners, of whom I was one and a managing partner with that. But just to say that, I think there is an inherent, issue with the model that creates a certain tension. I'm also very happy that you, sort of deconstructed what I think is an artificial divide between in-house lawyers and outside counsel, to the effect that, at the end of the day, they both have to account to their customers.
Exactly. I think that point about customers that we were making earlier, it applies to law firms, applies to everybody. And the successful ones, the enlightened ones, think about the customer's interest as their own.
Right. Well, I could go on with you all day, but you've got other things to do. And I want to just close out with, can't not ask you a little bit about the technology, specifically about data and AI. So let's start with data. As you know far better than I think it was 2017, 2018, The Economist, had that famous article saying that data is the new oil.
Right.
And it's kind of ironic, because maybe it should be the new, energy source, something other than oil. But be that as it may, the legal function is still, operating in more of a horse and buggy, as opposed to using the oil that can be mined from data. And I'm wondering, how valuable do you think that the legal functions more extensive and thoughtful use of data would be, not only to its own standing within the organization, but even more importantly, to the overall enterprise?
Mm-hmm. Well, data can be immensely valuable. And I get that was the point that the economists want to make. But I think what it didn't emphasize enough by calling it oil is the importance of refining it. And there's so much useless data, and you really need to, that's why machine learning has become so valuable, is it's a way of making sense of a lot of data that otherwise is useless. I mean, you could say that maybe data is the new sand, because sand can be converted into microchips that are immensely valuable, but by itself doesn't add that much value in most functions. So I would really stress the importance of making use of the data. It starts with gathering a lot of data, but most companies make use of a fraction of the data that they could be using. And the revolution in machine learning in particular is a way of converting that data into something that helps you make better predictive analytics, better decision-making, and overall creates value.
And I want to get to machine learning in just a moment, but just one final question on the data element. How important is it not only for the legal function to mine and share its own data resident within the legal function, but also, to share it, for example, with HR, to share it with sales, to share it with other parts of the organization, and then conversely, to take in relevant data from other parts of the organization, as opposed to remaining siloed in the refinement of the oil.
Well, that's exactly how you unlock it, is by using it in these different ways. We did a study where we looked at what we call data-driven decision makers, and we scored all the companies we looked at. We had over 30,000 plants actually that we looked at with the US Census Bureau. And the more data-driven companies were substantially more productive and more profitable than their competitors who were not as data-driven on our scoring function. But it really depended on tapping into all this data. And this is where I think lawyers have a huge role, the legal profession more broadly, is that we don't have nearly the infrastructure that we need for sharing data. A lot of it is legal barriers. Of course, there's a lot of personally identifiable information. There are other proprietary aspects to it. And working out a mechanism by which we can share the data and make use of it while also protecting the parts that need to be protected is a very thorny question. I think it's something that conceptually we need to address it as a society if we want to unlock the value of data. And every company should be thinking about it really hard. If you can crack that nut, you're in a position to unleash a lot of value that your competitors won't unleash. And over the next few years, just as we're having a revolution in the technology of data sharing, we need a revolution in how we think about the legality and the rights and the principles for data sharing.
Yeah, and I want to just close by a little bit more on artificial intelligence, machine learning. Again, lawyers very often for such analytically refined people, I find sometimes that, when they are confronted with new ways of doing things, their visceral reaction is to break into two camps. The bluebirds who say, this is just going to ruin everything. And then, the other, sort of more exuberant ones who say, this is going to be a panacea. And I'm kind of inferring from you, Erik, and what you've said, that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? And that ultimately it's how humans are going to tap into the potential of these machines that really matters. Is that?
You're exactly right. It's frustrating. I run into these two extremes that seem to be so common. One group that thinks that AI is going to solve everything. The singularity is here. We're all going to be jobless. And the other group that thinks it's all just a big hype, that there's nothing to it. And both of them miss the mark. Certainly, technology is going to have profound effects. It's transforming almost every industry. But it's not going to replace all of our work, certainly not all lawyers. There are certain types of work, document discovery, which have been increasingly automated, and some of the more routine functions, and that's great. We can simplify that. But we're very, very far from what technologists call artificial general intelligence. The kind you see in the Terminator movies that can just do everything. And we won't be there for decades. So let's just calibrate a little bit what we're going to be able to do. I don't think technology is going to replace lawyers anytime soon, but lawyers who use technology, lawyers who use artificial intelligence will replace lawyers who don't.
Well, great way to end, Erik. As always, it's just fabulous to talk to you. I hope to see you again soon at one of our digital legal exchange salons or faculty advisor meetings, and always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks.